Good morning, crochet crafters. If you followed me for part 1 and part 2 of my sheep potholder series, we're using 100% cotton. I won't go back into the tools list. That was in part 1. And in part 3, we're going to add some furriness to the top of the sheep's head. If you notice in real life, some sheep have a lot of fur that hang over their eyes and face. So we're going to add that. If you don't want to, you can just leave the puff stitch that you have. If you do want to add that, you can follow me here right now. Also, I just wanted to mention that if you did want to add a few more rows to your sheep, you can do that to make a wider pot holder, or you could add another row of the double crochets, just one double crochet in each, and that would give you a larger pot holder. I think my size is pretty good. If you've used a larger crochet hook, so mine is like 6 by 6, which is still a pretty good pot holder. If you want an 8 by 8, you can use a larger hook. So we're going to go ahead and turn our work so that we're looking at the back of the sheep's fur right here. And we're going to start out using a smaller crochet hook, a size 2. And I've already kind of loosened these loops a little bit so that you can see where it's going in. But on the top of your sheep's head, if you remember and you recall, when we were making this row around the black, we left the top loop. And we left that top loop across so that we could add some more of the sheep's puffy hair. But working from the back down, in the first loop, you're going to cast your yarn on. I call it casting our yarn on. You just wrap the front and the back on the hook, and you basically wrap it around and chain one. Now, in the next, most of the time I say that's casting on, and we're not going to use that, but in this case we are going to use that as a loop. And I'm going to work my tail back in. If you can't, you can sew it back in or cut it. So in the next loop, you're going to do another single crochet. So I'm using my tail, and with this size hook, it's a little difficult. Again, you don't have to wrap your tail back in. I think I've wrapped it as far as it can go. So it's there. I've wrapped it in twice. And now I'm just going to work in the front loop all the way across, doing a single crochet. And again, this is a small crochet hook, so it is a little bit more challenging to do this, I understand. But you can bend your craft like this too. So if it's easier, you can see the loops, bending the craft. Excellent. Much easier to do as you get going. And as you can see, you're building a platform, essentially, is what you're doing here. When you get to the end of all the loops that you can see, making sure you have all your yarn, chain one and turn. So now you're looking at the front of your work. And I'm going to go ahead and I've worked my tail in. I'm going to cut it. If it's not worked in the first 2 loops or the first 3 loops, you need to go ahead and make sure that you work it in or sew it in, because it will come undone in the wash. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create some shaggy hair. So I actually am going to leave this a little loose. And working a loose stitch, I'm going back in the front and back loop, and you'll see why it has to be so loose. But the reason I have to have a 2 is because otherwise I'll just tear the whole loop apart. Let's start over on that one. I'm going to wrap it around and going through the back and the front loop, pulling through, loose. Wrapping it around, back and front loop, pull it loose. Wrapping around, back and front loop, pulling it through, and it's loose. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the hook. Wrap it around. Now hold it tight and pull that loop through. And it may be a little bit difficult to work. Now we're not going to do a chain one on this. We're going to wrap it around and just go into that second loop. And again, if you want to bend your work, because it's easier, and you should have 7 on your hook. I missed that last yarn. And there you go. So you're wrapping it 3 times until you have 7 strands of yarn on your hook, and then the 8th one you're pulling it through. And if you're using a 2, if you want to continue to use a 4, you can, but you see when I'm pulling this hard, sometimes a 4 will really pull the loops way up, and I don't want it to look like it's like pulled apart. So you can see I'm kind of making that little thing that hangs over the sheep's face. And there's many ways to do this. Oh. It's always 3 times over the hook. And I lost a little yarn there. Again, I'm using a very small, for this type of yarn, I should be using a little bit bigger crochet hook, but I need this size. So we're going all the way across what we just created, and we're wrapping it 3 times for that kind of a puff stitch, or wrap 3 times. And we're not chaining like we did. We're just wrapping. Take your time. You can meet me back over here if it takes you a little time, because I've been doing this a while and I'm still, it's a tight stitch to work with. But make sure when you get to the last loop that you want to add in, you get the back and the front loop. It always is a little bit of a challenge, because sometimes that back loop is hiding on you. Oh, I got it all through, but it just didn't come together. There. So when you have your sheep, you have your little sheep's pullover. Isn't that cute? Now, if you want it to stay down a little bit, you can come back in this, where you have this loop right here, and you can put your yarn through, or your hook through that, and slip stitch it off like so. The other thing you can do is, if you prefer, you can just take a little bit of a crochet needle, and you can actually just cut that off. I'm going to cut this off like so. And what I'm going to do with this crochet needle is I'm going to go back under to the back of the, and this is where when you guys sewed in your last stitch, when you tied off that last one, that's where I sewed it in, and it had a little bit of a piece left over. Okay, so that kind of helps me keep the puff stitch down. Now I'm going to go to the back, and ta-da, my back looks just as beautiful as my front. And it's important, and the reason it's important is because if you're going to sell it, and I've been selling everything at Lori's Handiwork on Etsy, anything I make with you on YouTube, I sell to somebody who wants. I don't sell it for a lot of money, but I sell it on Etsy. And because I do that, I want to make sure that my customer is happy. And when they get something from me, if I, you know, because a lot of people don't show the back of their work, and if you order something, you don't want it to have all kind of straggly yarns and uneven work in the back. That's just not professional. Especially if you want good feedback, you want to make sure that, and the other thing you want to make sure is that you tie it all in so that if you tell somebody they can wash it in the machine, that they're not coming through the machine and they're going to have all kinds of yarn loose after it comes out of the machine. Now with cotton, you want to make sure you don't put it in the dryer, because what does cotton do in the dryer? It shrinks. So you just want to lay this out flat, and I always put a little instruction sheet to my clients to lay it out flat and let it dry. But here's what I've done, and you can do this very easily too if you know how to sew at all. And if you don't, you can watch me. I have added that really adorable little puffer for the sheep. Now, since I have this, I'm just going to go through one more time, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it. I have a very bad hangnail on my, and I'm going to pull it through, and then I'm going to tie it off here. But you know what? I wanted to show you guys something. If you've been watching me sew, you can see I'm sewing different ways, but I'm making sure that when I sew that I'm not compromising the integrity of the stitches. In other words, I'm not sewing and leaving a big stitch like this across, which you think, oh, I'll just go through and sew. No, when you sew, you have to be sure that you work it through the way that your stitches are lined up, so that no one can ever tell where you really hid, quote, those ends, those yarn. And if you're not a tail person where you work your tails back into your work as you crochet, and you're new to crocheting, so you don't want to take that, you know, that extra time to try to figure out how to work that yarn back in, sewing it in is a really important thing to do, because again, if you just cut it, the exception is the cards. If I'm making cards and I'm going to glue them down, it really doesn't matter whether you sew it in tight. But anyways, I like to sew it in tight, and I'm going to hide this last little piece right under here, and voila, that's the top of my sheep's little furriness. I think it came out really nice. And the next video, we're going to do part 4. We're going to do the ears, and we're going to do the feet. Thank you for joining me.